turn on my recording. So hello, thank you so much for coming, for taking your Friday night to hang out and look at some art. I'm Nick. I think I've met all of you at least a few times. I'm going to be talking about work that I have in a show currently at Access Gallery here in Sacramento. So if you're in striking distance, it'd be great to see you. If you're not in striking distance, check out the website, check out the install. We're going to have a second Saturday opening tomorrow, the first opening reception that we've had at Access since, I guess, March. I don't even know if we did March 2020. So very long time. Masks, of course, social distancing, of course, but there's also an amazing show opening up at Verge. So should be fun to come out, check out. It'd be amazing to see everybody. Okay, so that as well. Perfect. Cool. So let me bring up my presenter view here. How does that look to everybody? Can you see it? Maggie's giving me the thumbs up, so glad. Thank you for that. Okay, so the title of the show is As Built. As Built is a reference to, well, a bunch of things. But when you make architectural plans of a building that exists, you want to actually understand how the building really is rather than the way it was designed to be. So, you know, if a wall is supposed to be 20 feet long and it's actually 19 3/4, you want to know that. So as built plans are the way you refer to the sort of as built measurements, the way the building actually exists. And for me, super interested in the way that we build things, the way that we build, so like buildings, but also objects, and even thinking more metaphorically, society. What is this thing that we've built together? So this is the sort of title card for the show, and we'll see some more installation views. I actually want to rewind. So Seth earlier showed a picture of mine from about 2013. I want to rewind back to some earlier work of mine. I've been interested in still life for a really long time. And so here's a piece from grad school, Still Life with Trophy and Duck Sauce. This work was very much inspired by the Dutch masters, and that really structured the work that I made for a long time. I think many of you know that work. The project was called De Bekken de Vereld, which is known world, and the idea with that was, even with the title, take something well known, the known world, and make it just a little bit unfamiliar by changing the language. So here we have these very familiar objects, some pocket change, some duck sauce, a upturned coffee cup, a trophy that I won when I was a kid. And I just tried to look carefully at it, you know, through arrangement. I continued working with still life in different ways, and I would say I'm still working with it. But I've tried to kind of deconstruct the idea of the still life and tweak what I'm doing with the images. So now, rather than the sort of normal surface with the floral arrangement, in this one here, it's the foam that you use to arrange the flowers and a fake orange and fake flowers on an overturned pedestal. So the kind of artificiality of the setup is very much on view, you know, so it's not something that you maybe just encountered on a table but rather something that's very self-consciously arranged for the camera. This was a still life where I combined different images. So a pink bouquet of fake flowers and a cyan bouquet of fake flowers, and they're just overlaid. So sometimes that kind of deconstruction is there in the scene, and sometimes it's a little bit more digital. So this is kind of moving up in time here. In this picture, Blue Ridge, I placed a little piece of pink paper in there that you sort of expect that to be the digital intervention in the photo. But it's actually there, and you can sort of see the reflection here. But then all of these marks that I made kind of behind that table are digital interventions. So I've sort of used the still life as a way, yes, to talk about familiar objects, right? A toothbrush or roll of tape. And then also to sort of play with visual expectations. And here, even we're sort of cropping up,
I don't think that machine will do it.
you know, seeing
No,
some, sorry, just looking, there we go. Sorry, we're starting to see some pieces from like building materials start to crop up. So just like a random folding table, as well as some insulation here in the background. Thanks to anybody who's joining. I'm just sort of sharing some different approaches that I've taken to still life over the years. This piece was called Pylon. Bad joke about pylons. Maggie's shaking her head at me. And in this case, the cones are there kind of just as colors, sort of elements that just provide a little warmth and a shape. And then the painter's tape is another kind of color. Here, really the upper half of the photo, so everything above this lighter bit of tape was digitally created. It was just something Photoshop kind of made on my behalf. So here the still life again is sort of the place to experiment with how images get made, right? How do spaces get made? That's something that I'll come back to. How do we build these things? And then also, how do images get made? And in some still lifes, it's very much just the building materials themselves. So here I was really drawn to this, the purple of this drywall, and then the little like yellow that's comes along with that, in contrast to the neutral sort of gray and brown here on the backside. And there's also quite a bit of digital manipulation here as well, where this purple space up on the top is a digital sort of overlay that confuses the space even more than it already is confused. So I think that previous one, Strata, is a good example. And then this one, Open Studio, are good examples of images where my still life sort of started to get bigger and bigger, just like physically bigger and bigger, and encompass more of the space that I was working in. So here's a process view of that previous shot, Open Studio, where I kind of took over my whole studio space, and it became this kind of like Fred Sandback like installation sculpture in the studio, where I had some insulation taped to a column, and then I had different kinds of rope sort of strung across the way, all really for the camera. So here's just another view of that. And I'm also interested in how the camera really transforms these things from physical arrangements into two-dimensional imagery. So that interest in these really mundane objects and in sort of the elements that we use to build the world, wanted to work with those again. And I was thinking for this exhibition, really, how could I start to think about these installations, these sculptures that I've been building and calling them arrangements for still lifes? How could I think of those as sculptures in the space? And how can I think of them as arrangements in photos? And like, what's the difference there? This piece is called Bungee. And there are a few screws, you know, there are some screws there, but really this piece and pretty much all of the arrangements that you'll see in this presentation are mostly held together by gravity, maybe a little bit of tape, and sort of me not walking around too fast in my studio to create too much of a breeze. So this one is called Bungee because this bungee cord really is holding the whole thing together. You know, it adds its own sort of bit of color that plays, the red and the cyan play off of each other. And then we have the sort of warmth of the wood. But this thing stands up on its own, but sort of as soon as you release that bungee cord, it just collapses. And I think of this more largely about the sort of last year, like, okay, well, what was the bungee cord that the pandemic and that other things kind of revealed? You know, the structure of the sort of larger society that we think of as being really quite stable for the last year and a half has not felt as stable for a number of reasons. And so to me, in many ways, the bungee is like that sort of linchpin there. It's the thing that keeps it all together, and it stays for the photo, but it's all pretty precarious too. This piece is called On Balance, and we're bringing back that pink insulation. I think that we'll see a lot of repeated elements from image to image. You know, these are the screws that I used to build my installation for my last show, a mechanized pencil, back in 2019. And these things are sort of around my studio, and I think about how to reintegrate them. Sometimes it's just a color. I wanted to have the green and the green here sort of relating to each other. And other times it's a little bit more about like the wood structure that's kind of holding things together. When I started working on this project or this exhibition, I wasn't tracking timber prices very well, but using all of the wood seems like recycled scrap wood that I just sort of have around feels a little bit more relevant now than maybe it did at the outset. So I talked before about how these arrangements are really quite precarious. And if I walk the wrong way or if I brush against something, they tumble down. So this piece is no exception. So the previous one On Balance is in the show. This piece, Collapse, is also in the show. And so for me, being able to have both of those things, the arrangement as it's sort of meant to be shown, and the arrangement as it's sort of revealed to be just these parts lying on the ground, I think that's important. I don't know that everybody who looks at the show will necessarily recognize that those pieces are related across the room, but that's certainly something that I hope many people will pick up on. I'll just go back and say one more thing. In this sort of collapsed version, we see the like double-sided tape, you know, that I use to assemble these things. So the way, the tricks of the trade, the things being revealed or on display, I'm happy that some of those come about, even if, and I've talked about this for some time, you can't see the manipulations that I've done digitally, the sort of color corrections and masking. Those are all the things in a sense that are behind the wall, behind the veneer, even if some of the things are still on display. So I just want to take a quick detour here and talk about a few influences and show some of my work with it. Christopher Williams is a photographer, conceptual artist, who works very much. He really uses these spare installations, but he will sort of show the edges of the temporary walls. And then also he really asks you to consider how the images relate to each other in the gallery. So for example, here's a view of a show he had at Zwirner in New York back in 2011, where we have 3 seemingly identical images of cars that if you stand in the right spot, you can say, wait a minute, how are these photos different? Or if you sort of entered behind this wall, so you saw this one first, then this one, then this one. And it's like, why am I seeing the same picture 3 times? And then as you turn around, you can say, oh, there's this relationship, and I'm sort of meant to think about how these different colors play out in those photos. And so I've really tried to think about installation as an important part of my work, not just sort of the thing that happens for the show, but really that the show is in some way an artwork on its own. So this was the last exhibition I had at Axis in 2019, fall 2019, and I had a wall built diagonally. Thank you, Maggie, for your help doing that. A wall built diagonally across the gallery, so you couldn't see everything in the gallery at once. And then also here, there's like this forced perspective almost to this smaller print here. And I also wanted to leave the sort of insides of the wall open. So you're seeing on one side the more finished wall, and then as you walk around, you see just the drywall and the inside of the wall with the studs and the wood and so on. So in this show, I haven't built any additional structures necessarily, but I am really trying to think about how my images exist in the world as objects, and how the installations that I make can be part of the work as well. So this is the way that I'm displaying collapse in the show. So this is a 44 by 54 print that's sort of on the wall, and then it curls onto the floor, and it's just held up with the painter's tape, you know, the temporary painter's tape. And I'll share with all of you here that this piece of wood is this piece of wood, and this piece of wood is this piece of wood. Maybe you notice that, maybe you don't notice it, but the sort of relationship between the photographed thing and the thing, that's been a fraught relationship for a long time in photography, and something that I want to try to call attention to in a piece like this. I'll also say that even this installation is quite precarious. So I tried to take that idea of the arrangements or the assemblages as being these things that are just barely standing up, and bring that to the work that's in the show as well. So over the weekend, the print fell down and was sort of like mostly on the floor, because that tape is not a permanent thing. So even if I'm not necessarily talking about that explicitly in the photos, I want the sort of precariousness of the installations to contribute to the way that we think about these larger things. So I'll segue. Here's another installation where I'm using, and I'll come back to some of these pieces a little bit later. I've used different pieces of insulation, and then here is a assemblage that has no screws, no fasteners or anything. It's only held up just by the sort of way that it's balanced here. piece is called Pump Jack. This was the first piece that I made for this show. And here we see the piece of wood again crawling up. The rubber band is the thing that's just holding by tension. It's just holding this sort of piece of white scrap wood there. This zip tie is what's allowing this wood to sort of stay just barely balanced. And then this paint sample is again just balanced up on top of all of this. So there's this structure, and it looks like an oil pump jack. There's this structure that is really sort of held together in these very precarious ways. And if you brush against it or you balance it just quite not the right way, it will sort of come tumbling down. And I think in many ways, I think of that as this larger metaphor for how we are maybe a little precarious here. And I mentioned this before, I've been interested in what's behind the walls for a long time. So not just the nicely painted finished wall, but what's sort of behind that. And you saw that in the previous installation view where I had the interior of the walls in 2019 on display. So this is a piece for grad school as well. There's a very odd shaft between the bathroom in my apartment and the kitchen in my apartment. So this is a photograph looking from the bathroom into the kitchen to sort of reveal those electrical boxes and the metal studs and the inside and sort of the grittiness there. So here, just returning to the first piece of bungee, some of the insulation that keeps us cool or warm also serves as this magical surface on which to display this piece. And I'm really interested in the sort of the like dappled or mottled surface of the insulation in relation to the dappled or mottled surface in the background of this picture and the way they kind of play off of each other. And I'll just sort of mention here, there's this very slight reflection here. And that is from this purple sheet of insulation. So I'll come back to that, I think, in a few minutes. Keep moving. The idea for this piece came of a show that I had, or some pieces that I had up at the Holland Project in Reno this spring. I was working with Dan Trejo, who curated the show, and my pieces sort of prepared like this. And I said, well, you know, I've been playing around with this idea of like putting something on insulation or on something. What do you think? And he was like, you got to do it. So we took this insulation that had previously been in my attic and like put it in a nice sleeve so it didn't get damaged. It felt kind of funny, but and then it went in the show here. And what I love about this stuff is because it's a mirrored surface, it's sort of a odd, like a not perfectly smooth, but a very highly reflective surface. It reflects whatever's around it. So it brings in the rest of the room. So here we sort of see the light from the outside reflecting off of it. And then thinking about doing that at a larger scale in a different space, I wanted to find ways to bring that sense of changing reflections to the piece as well. So here's a good example where the light bouncing off of this insulation sort of adds this bit of color to that piece that isn't there necessarily. It's not there on its own. It's something that depends on the sort of rest of the environment as well. I will also just say that some of these ideas come from teaching. So like I was teaching studio lighting this semester and spending a bunch of time with my students talking about the family of angles and sort of how reflective surfaces work makes me think about how to incorporate that into the pieces that I make as well. So the reason I have this one next here is that I just want to point out these kind of like red and purple little highlights that show up there. So this is a clear dowel. I don't really know what it is. I'm not even sure where I found it, but it's like this clear long dowel, and then it's refracting some red paper that's off to this side and some purple paper that's off to this side. So these are things that are outside of the still life, outside of the arrangement, that get reflected in there as well. And again, we have the like rubber band kind of holding everything together, or the zip ties holding things together in what is otherwise just this precariously balanced kind of arrangement. Here's another example of the reflective surface and the family of angles, and how these things kind of incorporate, or how they come into my work. Again, we have just like this slight yellow reflection in this delightful tape that like plays off of the yellow there in the little bit of rebar. This one is called projection because of the way the light is being projected onto this glass, and then also how the rebar is sort of coming out at us. This is another example, I think, of a picture where I'm just, if the insulation in the previous shot, you know, that beautiful sort of silvery metallic thing that we just stuff up in our walls, if that's something that I'm just drawn to visually, so are these moving pads or these moving carpets that you use. You just, you know, throw them around things to protect them, but they have this amazing sort of sheen and color. And so I wanted to incorporate that into this piece. So this show is really a departure for me, because for the first time I've said, okay, it's not just the installation of the work that is going to be something I'm sort of physically including, but also I'm going to make assemblages that live in the gallery as sculptures. So this is that blue blanket reappearing here, and this piece is on the opposite wall from the other one, so that may be something that visitors pick up on. But I'm certainly a photographer coming to sculpture. I'm looking at color and the way these things are arranged. So the sort of complement of the red and the cyan, or the green and the magenta here, and how those things build compositionally. And then here's this piece this way. So sort of from different angles. Thing when you see it in the space is I'm not controlling the angle anymore. This is no longer open studio where it's the bit of insulation that's just sort of like perfectly vertical with the lines that are perfectly illuminated. Now there's that sense of dimensionality. And I think this piece is a good example of one of the other things that's really been on my mind, which is just the endemic homelessness in Sacramento and in California and across the country as well. So this temporary construction, it's like a little shelter. It's aestheticized for sure, and it refers to the still lifes I've been making, but I also wanted to call to mind some of what we see sort of on the way to the gallery as well. So these things don't exist in a vacuum. That sense of the precariously balanced thing that extends to being housed or not housed, that extends to sort of how we can be in our lives. And I want that to be sort of subtext in the show. But that's been an important part of my process, is sort of thinking about how to get at some of those ideas, maybe metaphorically. So I said before, with this piece, you can walk around, you can see inside of it, you can move up and down. With the photographed arrangement, I'm really dictating how things intersect here. So this is about the beam in the back, and then all of these different intersections and the sort of shapes and colors that they create from there. In addition, I chose here to leave a lot of kind of the film process of this picture. So around the corners, these dots are all from the little clips that the lab uses when they develop the film. So they put these little clips on and then they dunk it into the chemistry. And then this air bubble here is from the scanning as well. So these are little nods at the process behind the photo, which is otherwise just, as I sort of said before, just the veneer, not the, unlike painting or unlike, clay, sometimes you sort of can't see the layers of the process that went into it. And so I tried to nod to some of that sometimes in the images. Here's another installation, and this is a video. So I'm gonna play a video now, just like a 45-second video that will give you a sense of like how the gallery sounds right now, because it has this very loud projector. And also this piece is a little video that gets to some ideas that I've been kind of working with for a long time. And in this case, it was also, how can I like continue to tweak the way that we interact with the photo, right? So if I'm having some still photos and some objects, another way to tweak the way that you're kind of encountering the photograph as an object is to make it into something projected or something that's moving, changing maybe. Okay, so let me share that. And you'll see the piece itself is just going to be changed sort of subtly. Lighting changes ever so slightly, the focus changes a little bit. So why have a still image that's changing so subtly, in the gallery? This piece that I saw in New York, I think 2009, something like that, has really made an impact on me. That's a piece by Nish Kapoor. And I talked about this at my last gallery talk. But the premise of this piece is that it's a sculpture that is so large in such a small space that you can't encounter it all at once. You have to move from room to room. And the only way that you can sort of think about the entirety of the object is by holding it in your memory. I love that idea. So here we have different angles on this, and then you can see it's kind of going into the wall, and then from another angle, you're looking into the piece itself. Here's maybe like a maquette that's maybe a little bit clearer. So you get these glimpses kind of the of the piece of the object. And it's only later that you can kind of think about it as a whole. So thinking about installation, right? We've seen these kind of diagonal lines in lots and lots of images, and that's something then that comes back. Or if you look at that piece and use the video steps, if you look at that piece and it's in focus, and then you come back around to it 2 minutes later, and all of a sudden it's out of focus, hopefully you have a little thing that says, wait a minute, I thought that piece was in focus. What, did something happen? Or here, this background in this particular image, the background is light. Maybe you come back around later and then it's dark. And those sort of slight changes that just make you stop and think a little bit about sort of your experience of that picture is what I'm trying to get at. Some other things with this particular image, let's see, I'm just gonna go back to this one here a little closer. So this is actually photographed in the Axis space. And depending on where you stand, you can kind of see that same wall and the same floor. And they're not at that different of a scale, but the photograph is transforming things too. So again, it's that space at a previous time, and it's also space you're currently in, but maybe you're not sort of quite recollecting that. All right, I'm going to jump ahead a bit more here. Great. This piece is called Lean 2. This is another one of the assemblages in the show. And this is entirely gravity. We've got sort of a studio sandbag, as well as some just like plastic sheeting, and then a couple wooden pieces providing balance there. So thinking back to that Anish Kapoor piece where you have to move around to encounter things differently, here, when you walk into the show sort of from the right of this piece, it presents just like this, I guess just like this, and it has this sort of whiteboard. And then as you move around, there's this other element of color that comes into view. So sort of, I guess, rewards maybe close looking or paying attention. Another example of that idea of kind of memory comes through here in this piece called 4 Mil, which is a photograph that I made in the week that I was installing the show of this assemblage. So it's not just a piece that's there physically, it's also something that I've then come back in and photographed. And what we're seeing here is the sheeting reflecting that projection sort of behind it. It makes this amazing kind of satin texture. But the photograph is something pretty different from the structure itself. And so that's really something that I've been trying to explore in this show. Is I remember one of my friends, as I was preparing for this show, said, well, if you're going to have sculptures, what's the point of photographing them? And to me, the photograph is such a different thing than the piece itself. You know, maybe a piece like this that's meant as documentation is closer, but can this sculpture, which again, to me speaks to like both the sort of ad hoc structures that I see around town and somebody like Richard Serra, can that be this, and can it be the sort of transformed photograph? The last little bit that I'll just add here is that all of these elements of color, you know, I've talked about reusing elements. All of these elements of color are from where I painted, you know, the blue square that appeared in On Balance, or the edge of the wooden beam that is in Collapse. You know, maybe even this piece was painted on there as well. So a lot of this show is in some ways about the making of the show, as well as the precariousness of it. And in some ways that's been really liberating and fun to work with. So this is my last slide here, and I'm gonna stop my share so I can see you all again. And I would love to answer any questions that you have. And I'm gonna make sure, yeah, you can unmute yourselves. So thank you so much for listening, for your attention. And yeah, happy to answer questions. And it's so great to see your faces too. And I'm also happy to hang out and just schmooze later for more informal questions.
So Nick, what was it like when you're thinking about the pandemic and you're thinking about the political, I really enjoyed you talking about the instability of, the times and the country, and like when you were making this piece, like how did you, I don't know, how did it's kind of an interesting leap between your previous work. I'm not sure if I'm expressing myself a little bit.
So how did I make any given piece, or?
How did you make the leap, like to go into these kind of lean-to structures that were, it's such a departure from the more solid pieces, I guess.
That's a great question, Audrey. So maybe I'll go back to this piece here. So, like when I make still lifes, there's a lot of precariousness in these setups. Getting the cinefoil in the background to stand up like just so, or getting the pink to be in exactly the right spot for the camera behind the tape. In some ways, what I'm doing feels very similar. It's like bigger, and it's kind of revealing the trick, I guess, behind the still life a little bit more. But I think that always in the arrangements that I make, things feel sort of just perfectly like, okay, leave it, don't touch it, take the picture, okay, fell over, fine, I got the photo, right? So I think what I'm trying to say is that I've like felt that before, and maybe wanted to find ways to highlight that even more, possibly just thinking about things feeling kind of unsteady in their own way. So yeah, hopefully that made sense.
I don't have a question, but I have sort of an observation for you.
All right.
When you showed one of the installation shots of the show, there was that crate with the cord coming out of it.
Mm-hmm.
So it was just interesting because at first I thought that was a sculpture in the show, but then of course later then I realized it was the digital projector was inside there. But I really like that moment of thinking really everything you're going to see in there becomes a sculpture, or is it part of the room, or is it a sculpture? Or did you think about that when you created that box around the digital projector?
Absolutely. Jenny, I love the way you put that. I think I think in some ways the show is just like saying, okay, well, I've been making sculptures with the installation somehow. I should just admit to myself that I'm making sculptures. So for this one, that wasn't really planned to be a piece, and it's not stated as such like in the checklist, but I started with a white extension cord, sort of trying to hide it, and just a projector kind of sitting there. And I don't know, it felt like it needed, like, I was like, oh, should I get an orange extension cord, to call attention to that thing. That's the same milk crate that's in the projection piece. And that's a little Easter egg, as well as that. Let's see, I removed the text from the milk crate here. And also the recycle thing is backwards on that. So, if you want to kind of notice that stuff, it's there to be picked up on.
Well, yeah,
But-
and I think that's what you're making us do too. You're making us look at everything in that way, which that yellow or orange cord and the crate becomes just sort of as beautiful to me, I think, as some of the other sculptures you've created in there. And it makes me look at everything as a sculpture.
Well, great. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think it's a real question that I haven't quite answered yet. So like this piece with the insulation, is that piece the video? Is it the whole thing? I kind of hedge on that sometimes, and this is something that I kind of go back and forth on, because on one hand, I'm a photographer. I love making pictures and working on them. And on the other hand, I keep sort of coming back to these ideas of that sculpture that's not a sculpture on the checklist. It's a orange extension cord with a milk crate just hiding the projector. So I think that's definitely something that's going to be on the mind over the next several years for sure. I'd love to get a beer and talk about it up in Seattle with you.
That'd be great. I would love that too.
Yaju has a question. Is there thought on reflectability, light shadows of surfaces with sculptures in the gallery compared to a photograph hung on the wall in the gallery? I think what you're asking is like, how does the way I light the photos differ from the way that the gallery lights the sculptures? Yeah. I guess with Axis, part of the deal is just what the space is. So sorry, let me figure out, I'll just stop my share and go to the proper slide. Be a lot easier. I'll share this one. So Axis just has these big banks of fluorescent lights, and it's a little bit unlike a lot of galleries where they use track lighting to light everything. Axis sort of has these, they almost become geometric shapes themselves, and that's kind of just what the space is. It's this very neutral black box, or white box, excuse me. So Yashu, the answer is yes. I'm not quite sure beyond sort of just accepting that that's what it is. Not quite sure sort of what else to add there, but to say that I really enjoy how they become, kind of to what Jenny was saying, ideally I can make them part of the show somehow. That line, that bank of lights that goes around there, I can bring those lines kind of into your field of vision somehow. Whereas with the photos, the lighting, I think, is what helps give them dimension. And, honestly, most of the people who see these photos aren't going to see them in the gallery. Like, most of you will only see these installation views of the space, but really you'll see this picture on my website And so, I think of the photos as kind of living in those different spaces. So the way that I want this picture to work as a photograph is with these shadows kind of peeking out from behind that little bit of reflection off of the top there, and then fading into the chiaroscuro in the background. Or the way that the shadow becomes a compositional element and the light helps differentiate between the, I don't know, old baseboard or something and the carpet pad in the background. So I do think a lot, if not that I've solved anything, about the different places that people will see the images. And I think one thing that I should have said earlier too is, right, if most of the way that we see pictures is here in the kind of like glowing screen, I feel like I want to make the experience of the gallery something different than what you get when you look at the images on a screen. So that's really the kind of thing that's pushed me into making work like this, where you can see that picture on my website, but in the gallery, it's about the way you walk up to it and maybe the way it's fallen down, or the tape that's on there. So I'm very aware of the different ways that we interact with photos these days. And I try to make that in some ways part of the work as well. Yaju, did that even come close to answering your question?
Nick, there's a technical issue with your screen.
Oh, okay. Weird. You're seeing my presenter view notes. Odd. Megan and Molly, is that why you raised your hand? Okay, well, come on down.
Hello.
Hi.
It's interesting hearing you talk about wanting it to be a very different experience in person. One thing that's standing out is how much of a different experience the audio of that projector presents. Like seeing these images of this space that you've created that's very much white and very much quiet and clean, and then to have that audio pick up all of this noise and disrupt that quietude. What does that sound and audio, what does that represent for you? Or what was the thought process in wanting a projector that made so much sound?
I'm not sure that I wanted a projector that made so much sound, but once I had it, I felt pretty good about it. Like I could have found another projector probably that was a little bit quieter, or I could have used a TV. But disrupting the quietude, I think, is a lot of what I want to get at. You're interacting with the things physically, and hopefully part of that is the sort of oral part of being in the space as well. So I think it's a kind of a happy circumstance, kind of like the orange extension cord, where being there, being in the space and sort of hearing it reverberate, it just felt like it was appropriate for the show. Also, I think about seeing, and this is like not even close, but I think about seeing films in museums sometimes where they'll set up the whole projector and it just is so loud, like amazing. But that you are in there, and that's sort of part, whether it's an intentional part of the artwork or not, it's part of the experience. And I think that that's kind of getting to what Jenny was talking about before, like, is it part of the artwork or is it not part of the artwork? And I'm also trying to be a little bit coy on that because I'm not sure if I've quite decided. So it was a happy circumstance. I think I'm into it. Great question though. Thank you. All right.
Wyatt joined us.
Thank you, everybody. Feel free, I'll stop recording. Feel free to stick around and schmooze for a little while. We've been here for about an hour, so thank you so much. And enjoy your Friday evening. Thank you.